Chapter 25, Troubled Innocence. So in this chapter, you'll notice it spans from 1945 to 1961. Notice we're kind of going back in time. So we talked about the Cold War, but now we're going to talk about, really domestic issues happening at home. And so this chapter, we're going to talk about peacetime transition in the boom years, the culture of the 1950s, the growth of the civil rights movement, and domestic politics in the Eisenhower era. So we're going to jump right into it because it's kind of a longer chapter. So 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States faced the challenge of reabsorbing about 9 million veterans into American life, all of whom had distinct family, career, and educational goals. For women, wartime had provided new job opportunities and the chance for military service, and these women were unenthusiastic about vacating their positions for men after the war. The end of the war also fostered a rise in the divorce rate and a spike in juvenile delinquency as families had spent significant time apart and struggled to reestablish patterns of behavior. These factors combined caused mounting fears that family life in the United States was disintegrating or starting to fall to pieces. So with fears swirling about the possibility of new economic depression, Americans spent cautiously and expressed concern about retaining the higher incomes they had earned during the war. So in 1944, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or as we call it now, the GI Bill, which provided veterans with educational opportunities and financial assistance. But the Truman administration did a poor job of managing the economic problems that arose in the post-war period. The labor movement was another contentious issue in the post-war years, as unions fought for better wages and Truman responded with hostility. In 1946, the government orchestrated a takeover of the railroads and threatened strikers. Republicans won control of Congress in 1946 and a year later passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which, remember the last video, those of you that watched it, we saw that picture of the strikers, and one of the pictures there was a black gentleman sitting in front of the sign and holding the sign was a white gentleman. But that limited the ability of unions to strike. And Truman vetoed the legislation seeking to undo the damage he had done to his relationship with organized labor, but Congress, they're going to override his veto and pass that act. So Truman's move to support civil rights had a negative influence on his relationship with Southern Democrats. And in 1948, South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond launched a presidential campaign under the banner of the States' Rights Party, or the Dixiecrats, which advocated segregation. Truman also confronted a challenge from the left wing of the Democratic Party when former Vice President Henry Wallace launched a campaign as the candidate of the Progressive Party. Wallace's campaign criticized Truman's Cold War policies. Truman also faced competition from Thomas Dewey, the Republican governor of New York. With so many candidates in the race, pundits and polls predicted that Truman would lose, but he won the election in part because he campaigned tirelessly and in part because the New Deal coalition remained strong and influential. So they actually had a newspaper, and I can't remember if we're going to see it in the slideshow or not, but it says Truman loses. And actually he ends up winning. So there's a picture of him holding that false report, because sometimes they'll run two stories, depending on how it goes. But he actually ended up winning. So it's kind of a funny picture. If I can find it, I'll post it. But liberals in this period began to support changes in tax code and monetary policies to create prosperity rather than redistribution of income or the shifting of corporate structures, ending a very icy relationship between corporations and the Democratic Party and redefining liberalism for the Cold War. Cold War liberals embraced vital center liberalism, which was anti-Stalinist, pro-civil rights, in favor of using the law to stamp out homegrown communism, and expanding the New Deal. Between 1945 and 1960, the U.S. economy expanded at a rapid pace, with the gross national product increasing 250%, per capita income growing 35%. Economic growth occurred more rapidly for ordinary Americans than it had in the whole of the first half of the 20th century, and the middle class grew exponentially. Union membership also skyrocketed in this period, peaking at nearly 17 million. Though the post-World War II era bore similarities in the 1920s, the prosperity of the 1950s had a much wider reach, with poverty rates declining and the concentration of wealth at the top of the economic ladder began to shrink. College attendance rates also increased. probably due to that GI Bill, making education status a symbol of middle class as well as the upper class. Consumerism became an important marker of economic health. In the post-war years, with televisions and cars filling American households, 87% of Americans owned a television by 1960. The car industry thrived on low gas prices, and the travel and fast food industries mushroomed. Chains such as Holiday Inn and McDonald's expanded rapidly over the course of the 1950s. Just to give you an idea, the gross national product is there in the red, and per capita income, you can tell we're kind of starting to finally catch up. So in the post-war years, rhetoric emerged that suggested women's roles as mothers and wives were essential to the protection of American democracy. Couples married young in the 1950s, with the average age for grooms hovering around the age of 23 and for brides around 19, and these couples began building large families rapidly. Young couples faced political and media pressure to build large families in context of the Cold War, as public officials suggested that strong families would build strong moral fiber within the nation and give the United States the momentum to fight Soviet communism. The development and widespread use of vaccinations in the 1950s gave parents more confidence to build and enjoy large families. Children were routinely vaccinated against diphtheria, whooping cough, tuberculosis, and in 1955, Dr. Salk succeeded in creating a vaccination against polio. So the baby boom, number of births in thousands, you can tell, like, this is during the war, but look, ooh, when the war ends, coming home and making babies. So those people that you call boomers, these are the years that they were born in, the baby boom. In the post-war years, the suburbs grew along with the middle class, with growing families seeking more space, fresh air, and pride that accompany home ownership. The federal government created the Federal Housing Administration to meet these demands by providing opportunities for people to purchase homes. This organization provided long-term mortgages to qualified buyers at low interest rates and gave further benefits to veterans. The government also funded the expansion of infrastructure, especially highways, to ease drivers' commute from suburbs. The housing industry grew as a result of increased demand for suburban homes, and the federal government responded by facilitating the process of building and buying houses. To meet the growing demand for housing, 38-year-old William Levitt applied the assembly line model to the production of homes in 1948, building a 17,000 house subdivision called Levittown on Long Island at a pace of 180 houses per week. The only thing is, he did not allow minorities into, what we call redlining. You don't allow minorities into these homes, into these neighborhoods, but we're going to see this next picture. Oh, someone integrated Levittown in 1957. You go, Myers. Levittown homes, which came with a washing machine and a television, cost $7,990 by 1950. 1.7 million new single-family homes were being built annually. Though suburbanization offered the American dream to millions of people, millions more were excluded. African Americans could not buy Levittown homes. So that was 1957, this picture that we saw the Myers integrating. But initially, they would not have been allowed in to these Levittown homes. Those were for whites only. A spreading pattern of residential segregation was supported by Levitt himself, by real estate agents, and by mortgage brokers, all of whom colluded to prohibit the sale of suburban homes to African Americans and other racial and ethnic groups by steering minority buyers away from white neighborhoods and by refusing to lend money to blacks looking to buy homes in white communities, an illegal practice called redlining. One of our former presidents is guilty of redlining in his apartment complexes. Towers, essentially towers. So this is still a practice that we see today, redlining. We're trying to slowly get rid of it, but as I just mentioned, we still have a lot of people that redline and a lot of places that still use redlining, although it is outlawed. Television also, and I want you guys to notice, there is no apostrophe. When you write years like 1850s, 1950s, never put an apostrophe there. There's not an apostrophe, it doesn't go there. That's grammatically incorrect and everyone does it, and it's one of those things that I just have to address before you leave my class. Please do not put apostrophes in years when you add an S. Okay, television had a profound influence on American politics, society, and daily life in the 1950s, no apostrophe, as the Columbia Broadcasting System, also known as CBS, the National Broadcasting System, also known as NBS, and the American Broadcasting Company, ABC, aired entertainment programs, series, Serious dramas and documentaries. Television networks also broadcast congressional investigations, offering Americans insight into political processes. The networks broadcast nominating conventions, election day tallies, and candidates' ads. Programming for children emphasized the triumph of good over evil and honesty over deceit, as seen in shows like The Lone Ranger, Superman, The Cisco Kid, and Howdy Doody. For adults, television shows such as The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, and Leave It to Beaver offered depictions of traditional family values and highlighted the triumph of traditional gender roles. Depictions of African Americans on televisions were usually degrading and stereotypical. Black female actors most often appeared as maids, and programs such as The Amos and Andy Show relied on negative depictions of African Americans for laugh. American Indians largely were portrayed as savages, with the exception of Tonto on The Lone Ranger, and Latinos and Asians rarely appeared on television at all. While television offered an image of innocence in American life, the film industry offered depictions of teenagers that were harder, wilder, and less savory. In Rebel Without a Cause, that came out in 1955, James Dean portrayed a lost, angst-filled teenager, while Marlon Brando played the leader of a motorcycle gang in the film The Wild One, that was in 1954. The Broadway musical West Side Story, that came out in 1957, made into a Hollywood film in 1961, was a retelling of Romeo and Juliet in the context of a gang war between white and Puerto Rican youths in New York City. Hollywood portrayed women in traditional roles. When women stepped out of traditional roles, they routinely did so to win a man. Film actresses also portrayed alluring women. Marilyn Monroe's The 7-Year Itch and Elizabeth Taylor's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof offered screen representations of highly sexual characters who eventually settled down or suffered. James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, just in case you're wondering what the movie poster looked like. So the term teenager was not coined until 1941, but by the 1950s, teenagers were a distinct social and cultural demographic with a disposable income from allowance or part-time jobs that accounted to approximately $10 billion in 1959. Teenagers were an important market for record players and televisions, and as an age group were important consumers of popular culture. By 1960, 90% of all working-class teenagers went to high school, and the percentage of African Americans who attended high school doubled between 1940 and 1960. This shift fostered cross-class encounters among a distinct age bracket, with middle-class kids attempting to emulate the style and decorum of working-class students. Rock and roll music, such as performed by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, and doo-wop groups such as the Platters, the Channels, the Chords, the Chantels, the Teenagers, gave teenage pop culture a distinctive sound. Blacks were the first rock and roll performers. But white artists added rural flavor to those genres, such as Elvis Presley, adapted black performance aesthetics he had encountered while growing up in Mississippi and Tennessee to his own style and garnered a large and enduring audience. Elvis's television appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 highlighted these generational tensions. While teenagers in the studio audience were wowed by his sexualized pelvic gyrations, television standards of decency dictated that he be filmed only from the waist up. In the 1950s, medical and psychological professionals suggested that women would be happy only if they embraced their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Dr. Benjamin Spock argued in the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care that women needed to stay home and watch their children to ensure the success of their offspring. While Ludenberg and Farnham declared in Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, that there could be no such thing as an independent woman. The emphasis on marriage and family shaped women's attitudes about their lives, but many women felt frustrated, depressed, and anxious in these roles and took tranquilizers and drank alcohol to treat their depression. In spite of the stereotype of the woman who stayed at home to care for her family, the proportion of working wives and mothers actually doubled between 1940 and 1960, with the bulk of working women coming from an African American or working class immigrant background. Women's magazines also celebrated career women and offered stories on Maine Senator Margaret Chase Smith, the African American educator Mary McLeod Bethune, and athletes such as Babe Zaharias. Women also fought for equal pay through labor unions, joined women's clubs and organizations like the YWCA, and engaged in politics, peace activism, and charitable activities. This is what the stereotypical housewife is supposed to look like. right? Very prim and proper, very neat. Everything in at least the refrigerator looks organized and in place. But as we just read, a lot of women did begin working outside of the home, although they were supposed to be this is the epitome of white middle class. But we have Governor Smith. So out of the anxiety of the Cold War, we're going to see this religious revival, and it came mid-century in the United States, with American church attendance standing in stark contrast to the godless communism of the USSR. In politics, Congress added the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954 and made "In God We Trust" the national motto. In the 1950s, 95% of Americans professed a belief in God. Theologian Will Herberg suggested that the uptick in religiosity in the United States reflected a desire for community, belonging, and security in a rapidly changing world. Television and popular culture spread religious sentiment. The Catholic Bishop Sheen offered 10 million viewers a weekly message celebrating life and attacking communism. Norman Vincent Peale published a self-help book called The Power of Positive Thinking that fused religion with personal uplift, and the Reverend Billy Graham traveled the country, spreading religion and condemning communism. By the end of the 1950s, the definition of patriotic citizen required that every American embrace religion. But we do have some nonconformists. A group of young artists, poets, writers, musicians, and intellectuals emerged in the 1950s known as the Beats. Poets like Allen Ginsberg and writers criticized middle-class comfort, celebrated nonconformity, and embraced African-American culture expression, including jazz, and an attitude of coolness. In the 1950s, jazz performers stepped away from big bands and began to perform in smaller groups, experimenting with new musical styles that emphasize unique sound over dance beats, and that often served as an expression of racial pride in an effort to critique white supremacy. Homosexuals existed outside of the mainstream norms in the 1950s, but they also garnered new attention when Alfred Kinsey's research revealed that about 10% of the nation's adult population was homosexual. In 1951, buoyed by the experience of meeting other gays and lesbians while serving in World War II, politically radical gay men in Los Angeles organized the Mattachine Society to fight homophobia. The organization soon spread across the country. Here's some of the Beats, the Beat generation. But back to homosexuality. In 1954, a group of lesbians in San Francisco formed the Daughters of Bilitis, which functioned as a female counterpart to the Mattachine Society. However, in spite of forming new organizations, most gays and lesbians stayed in the closet for fear of retribution. Kinsey's research offered other revelations about American sexual behavior, including surprisingly high rates of premarital and extramarital sex. Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine offered images of nude women and instructions for men on how to be sophisticated and woo women. There's a novel called Peyton Place, and it exposed the sorts of tawdry relations that many Americans engaged in but hoped to keep quiet, and other authors, including Sloan Wilson and The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and The Catcher in the Rye, they offered critiques of conformity, suburbanization, and bureaucracy. We also are going to see the rise of the civil rights movement during this time period. And so after fighting for equality and democracy in World War II, many African Americans expected to win equality upon their return home. Although organizations like the Congress of Racial Equality, also called CORE, and the NAACP had won important battles during the war, whites still resisted the idea of racial equality. The tensions between the races erupted in 1946 when blacks were killed and their businesses destroyed in a race riot in Columbia, Tennessee. Unfortunately, the violence did not end there, and similar instances of attacks on blacks occurred throughout the South, leading the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women to demand presidential action. Truman responded by creating the President's Committee on Civil Rights in 1946. The following October, the group released its report identifying the problem of civil rights shortcomings and insisted on remedies for the problem. The committee used the context of the Cold War to argue for establishing equality between the races. In the 1950s, the NAACP pushed the issue of school integration. First, the association sued law schools and universities that excluded black students. In the 1950s, Thurgood Marshall took the helm of the NAACP's legal campaigns and succeeded in convincing the Supreme Court to order the integration of the University of Texas Law School and of facilities at the University of Oklahoma Graduate School, and to outlaw segregation in interstate railways. The success of the strategy to desegregate higher education was dependent on the desegregation of public schools. Under Plessy v. Ferguson, Southerners provided separate and vastly unequal educational facilities and resources to black students. Integration was the quickest path to achieving equality in education. So the NAACP succeeded on May 17, 1954, when Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court declared in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that, quote, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, end quote. In spite of the court's rulings, the integration of public schools took a long time. The Supreme Court's decision included a caveat that stated that integration should happen with all deliberate speed, but left enforcement of the ruling to Southern officials. So although the court case came out in 1954 and was ruled on, you are not going to see integration in the South until like the 1960s, almost into the 70s in some places. The Brown decision buoyed African American hopes for ending discrimination. In 1955, the Women's Political Council of Montgomery, Alabama, began a movement to end discrimination and segregation on city buses, with an emphasis on ending the custom of black passengers surrendering their seats to white passengers. On December 1, 1955, the black seamstress and activist Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and was arrested, spurring the black community in Montgomery to engage in a boycott of the bus system. The boycott instilled pride and strengthened the black community, and walking instead of riding became a status symbol. However, the boycott inspired resentment and frustration among whites, who arrested leaders of the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that spearheaded the movement. More than a year after the boycott began, the Supreme Court ordered the desegregation of the Montgomery bus system, and the Montgomery bus boycott catapulted Martin Luther King Jr. to the forefront of the growing civil rights movement. Here's just some of those women that were boycotting the bus. And again, walking was a symbol, status symbol. King, a Georgia native and a graduate of Morehouse College and Boston University, arrived in Montgomery just before the start of the boycott to serve as the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and ended up rallying the whole black community around the boycott. Embracing non-violence and the leadership styles of A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, King hoped to rally sympathetic whites behind African American causes and celebrated black communities, history, and culture. The boycott drew King into the center of the civil rights movement. In 1957, King and other Southern black ministers established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to spread nonviolent protests across the South. The growing momentum of the civil rights movement transformed African American communities, but also inspired significant white resistance at the grassroots level and in politics. In 1956, 101 Southern congressmen authored a manifesto stating that the Brown decision was a clear abuse of judicial power, and suggesting that politicians use all possible legal means to overturn that decision. At the grassroots level, white Southerners in Little Rock, Arkansas, used extra legal means to attempt to prevent integration when the city school board received federal approval of its plans to integrate Central High School. Arkansas Governor Balbus fought the court ruling by sending the Arkansas National Guard to prevent 9 black students from attending the school. President Eisenhower comes back by federalizing the National Guard and sending the 101st Airborne Division to quell escalating mob violence. The National Guard then escorted the black students in and out of the school for the rest of the year, but they were still subject to daily harassment and violence. Like, they were still targeted, they were still beaten up. So, although they're being escorted by the National Guard, there's still stuff that's happening to them on a daily basis. In 1958, Ernest Green, one of the Little Rock Nine, graduated from the school. Governor Falbus shut down Central High School rather than conduct another school year under integration, but the Supreme Court ordered the school reopened in 1959. Other school districts, including Prince Edward County, Virginia, nonetheless followed Falbus's example, and public schools in the South remained slow to implement desegregation. In the 1950s, the Ku Klux Klan experienced yet another resurgence in response to the burgeoning civil rights movement, and segregationists also organized the White Citizens Council, which used economic intimidation, such as threats of job loss and denial of credit, to keep African Americans oppressed. In Alabama, the White Citizens Council members even attempted to prevent radio stations from playing rock and roll because they feared that it would lead to interracial contact and destroy white civilization. White terrorist organizations got away with most of their violence and intimidation tactics. In 1955, a 14-year-old Chicago boy named Emmett Till was murdered while visiting a relative in Mississippi after he allegedly spoke inappropriately to a white woman. The alleged killers were brought to trial but were quickly acquitted by an all-white jury. Just to point out, he was allegedly catcalling this woman and speaking inappropriate to her. Years later, she will admit that it was all made up and a lie, and that this little boy died for nothing. College and high school students embraced the growing momentum of the civil rights movement and began to use a tactic known as the sit-in, in which African Americans and whites would also do this. They would occupy a space where they were unwelcome because of their race and would move only by force or if they received service. In February of 1960, a group of 4 Greensboro, North Carolina college students conducted sit-ins at Woolworth and Crest stores, spurring similar protests throughout the Southeast. In 1960, students who had participated in sit-ins formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which pushed for integration, political and economic equality, and desegregation. They also drew on the context of the Cold War and the hope generated by the Brown decision, but its members were subject to the fear and intimidation generated by the KKK, the White Citizens Council, and incidents such as the Emmett Till murder. Here's a map of the different sit-ins and where they happened. You'll notice we had sit-ins here in Texas too, kind of all along the South. African Americans who had migrated west also worked to advocate for civil rights. Groups such as the NAACP Youth Council in Oklahoma City adopted tactics already being used in the South, such as sit-ins to achieve integration in public facilities. So these sit-ins, they would just go to these restaurants and they would just sit there. They knew that they weren't going to be served. They knew that things were going to be thrown at them. They would have mustard and ketchup poured all over them, but they just sat there and they took it. The non-violence, the whole point is you don't react. You sit there and you take it. And either they're going to torment you or they're going to serve you. But either way, your point is being made. Malcolm X, he takes on a different tactic than what we're seeing here. He takes on a violent or a militant tactic. So it's a little bit different. But not only do we see World War II inspiring African Americans, but also other minority groups to fight for equality. Mexican Americans formed unit leagues in Southern California to protest segregation. These groups often joined with African American organizations to achieve their goals. In Texas, the League of United Latin Citizens, or LULAC, succeeded in desegregating movie theaters, swimming pools, restaurants, and other public facilities. World War II finally brought some gains to Chinese efforts for civil rights. The U.S. government repealed the Exclusion Law in 1943 and passed the War Brides Act in 1945. The bill allowed the admission of 6,000 Chinese women into the United States. Although the Chinese and Chinese American population had made significant gains during the war, the fall of China to the communists in 1949 and the subsequent war in Korea posed new challenges for Chinese communities on the West Coast. Chinese people were treated with suspicion, and the government established a confession program that allowed any Chinese individuals who were illegally in the country to stay if they pledged their allegiance to the United States and provided information about their friends and family. After the war, the federal government did not apologize or offer financial compensation for the losses incurred by Japanese Americans. All the same, Japanese Americans were largely successful in rebuilding their lives. The U.S. government did pass the McCarran-Walter Immigration Act of 1952, which made it possible for Japanese aliens to become U.S. citizens. In 1952, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower won the presidency with Cold Warrior Richard M. Nixon as his vice president, and in that year, Republicans also held slight majorities in the House and the Senate. Eisenhower embraced modern republicanism, which sought to integrate the ideals of republicanism, including individualism and the maintenance of a tight budget, into New Deal structures, leading to an increase in Social Security benefits and a rise in the minimum wage. The Eisenhower administration also added a new government agency, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, to the cabinet in 1953 and sought to improve education through passage of the National Defense Education Act in 1958, with the aim of keeping up with the Soviet Union. In 1957, the Soviet Union exhibited its scientific prowess, launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite into orbit. The Russians beat us in the space race. Eisenhower had to work with Democratic majorities in Congress for the majority of his presidency, yet he was able to forge bipartisan support for many of his proposals. Under the Eisenhower administration, Republicans worked with the Democrats to pass the first pieces of civil rights legislation. While the administration was able to make some improvements on behalf of American civil rights, American Indians remain excluded. Many of the reforms implemented during the New Deal were reversed. As a result, many tribes lost their federal benefits, and the tribal lands were transferred to state and local governments. Undocumented Mexican laborers were repatriated during this time. Those who were deported often experienced harsh conditions, sometimes resulting in death. In his final term as president, Eisenhower maintained his strict conformity to fiscal responsibility, clashing with Democrats over spending and vetoing bills that increased spending on public housing, public works, and similar projects. Eisenhower was a popular president and left office in good public standing, but his personal popularity did not transfer to the Republican Party or to the Vice President Richard Nixon, who ran to succeed him. Nixon's opponent was Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy, who became the face of vigor and progress in American politics, despite the fact that his policies were very similar to Nixon's. Kennedy's critics argued justifiably that his political career was a result of his family's wealth and reputation, and that he was a womanizer and a playboy. Television played a significant role in the 1960 election, with 4 televised debates airing to audiences around the country. The candidate's personal appearance gained rapidly increasing significance in electoral politics. We'll come back to that. The perception of the two candidates was influential in the outcome of the 1960 election. Kennedy looked polished and presidential in air, but Nixon looked tired and ill during the first debate. Though he had a vibrant persona, Kennedy was Catholic and faced significant prejudice in the South among Protestants, but he won new voters for the Democratic Party in the North. Race was a significant issue in the election, and the two candidates offered similar records on civil rights, with Nixon holding the upper hand. On October 19, 1960, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and jailed in Atlanta for participating in a sit-in. Kennedy offered his support to King's wife and got King out of jail. In response, blacks gave their support to Kennedy and were instrumental in the 1% margin of the vote, of the popular vote, that it took to put Kennedy in the White House. So you'll notice Kennedy, all these blue states, these Democratic states. Nixon, all the red Republican states. Harry Byrd, independent, not a whole lot, like part of Oklahoma. Here's the popular vote. You'll see it was very, very close. And even like the percentage of the popular vote itself was very close. So he barely won. He barely beat Nixon. So stay tuned. We're going to cover chapter 26, which we'll go back and pick up a little bit from this chapter, talking about the civil rights movement a little bit more. We're going to talk about Nixon more and Kennedy more as we move forward in our textbook and keep covering these last few chapters of the book.